Hello everyone. Today I'm prepared for you one of the most controversial games in recent chess history, a match between world champion Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann. It was this very game that made Magnus withdraw from the tournament entirely, indirectly accusing Niemann of cheating, something that had never happened before in his entire career. Since then, Carlsen has never played another official game against Hans. Let's see what happened that pushed the world champion to such a decision. Magnus has the white pieces. Hans Niemann plays black. The game begins with d4. Knight f6 from Hans, then c4, e6, knight c3, and black plays bishop e4, the Nimzo Indian. Magnus chooses g3, aiming to fianchetto his bishop on g2. An alternative was a3 or knight f3, or e3. All theoretical continuations. But Carlsen opts for his typical kingside fianchetto setup. Black castles, white brings out the bishop to g2. Then Hans strikes in the center with d5. Magnus delays castling and plays a3, forcing black to decide on the pin. Hans captures on c3, doubling white's pawns, and immediately grabs the pawn on c4. This is a pawn sacrifice by Magnus. In exchange, he opens the long diagonal for his g2 bishop. Magnus develops his kingside knight to f3 and prepares to castle. Black plays c5, attacking the center. White castles. Now Hans plays c4. Magnus recaptures with his queen on d4, offering an early queen trade. This is classic Magnus, pushing for an endgame, where he's practically a god. But Hans declines the trade and develops his knight to c6, attacking the queen. Now Magnus avoids the trade and simply recaptures the pawn on c4. Black has temporarily given up the pawn and plays e5, grabbing space in the center and targeting the d4 square. Magnus pins the knight with bishop g5, a classic move. He's preparing to bring his rook to the d-file. Hans kicks the bishop with h6, but before retreating, Magnus plays rook d1, pressuring the queen. Now comes a surprising moment. Instead of retreating the queen, Hans goes for a deep tactical shot, e6. It's a counterattack on Magnus's queen on c4, and also indirectly puts pressure on the bishop on g5. White is forced to take the rook on d8. Queen trades follow. Hans recaptures on c4. Magnus plays rook a8. Black recaptures with rook a8. We now reach an equal material position, but white has the bishop pair, while black has no immediate weaknesses. Magnus captures on f6, damaging black's kingside structure and doubling the f-pawns. But Niemann uses this to his advantage later. White now has to defend the e2 pawn, so Magnus brings his king toward the center, which will be helpful in the endgame anyway. Hans places his rook on the open d-file. Magnus moved his king to e1. Niemann activates his knight via a5, threatening to jump into white's weak light squares. Magnus brings his other rook to d1, but black refuses the trade. Instead, Hans targets the c3 pawn, which is weak and isolated. White's pawns on the queen side are clearly in bad shape. They're isolated. Black, on the other hand, is doing just fine. Magnus unveils his bishop by moving the knight, targeting the b7 pawn and also eyeing the bishop on c4. Black retreats his bishop to e6, and white's c3 pawn is now hanging. Magnus realizes he cannot save the pawn effectively. A move like knight e4 looks tempting. It pressures f6 and defends c3, but Hans plays f5, kicking the knight and preparing to take c3 next. Magnus could try rook c1 to defend the pawn, but then he would be placing his most powerful piece passively behind a doomed pawn. So Magnus sacrifices the pawn with c4, and Hans captures. After a piece trade, white is down a pawn, and the queenside pawns become a threat. Magnus invades the 8th rank with his rook. Hans calmly improves his king to g7. Magnus plays bishop d5, attacking the rook on c4 and eyeing f7. His idea is to swing the rook to d7 and start attacking the 7th rank. But Hans cuts him off with rook c7. Magnus shifts his attack to the queenside, going after a7. Hans calmly plays a6, defending. Now white plays rook b8, targeting b7. Black cannot defend b7 with the knight alone, so Niemann plays the stunning f5, turning his doubled f-pawns into a central weapon, controlling the key e4 square. This prevents white from playing e4 and reinforcing the bishop on d5. Magnus shifts his rook to e8, targeting the e5 pawn. Hans calmly defends with e4. The white king is now feeling exposed. Carlsen tries to undermine the f5 pawn with g4, sacrificing it to win e4, but Hans plays rook c5, kicking the bishop from the dominant diagonal. The bishop retreats, and Hans brings his knight back to the center. The pawn on a3 is hanging, so Magnus plays a4. Niemann continues with knight d6, increasing pressure and slowly suffocating white. Black quietly, but surely, starts choking white. All in Magnus's own style, by the way, only now it's used against him. The computer evaluates this position at -1.5 pawns for white. Magnus moves his rook one step back along the 7th rank, eyeing the f7 pawn in various lines, using the bishop on a2. Now the knight basically must stay put for black. But black captures the pawn on g4, doubling their pawns along the f-file and gaining 2 extra pawns. Magnus places his rook on d7, attacking the knight. If the knight moves, he will take the pawn on f7. Then comes another one of Hans's strongest moves, e3. He leaves his knight under attack, but the key is the pawn on e3. This is exactly the type of pawn I mentioned earlier, pawns that clamp down white's position like a vice. And now the vice snaps shut. For example, if you take the knight on d6, it's checkmate in 1, rook to c1 along the first rank. The pawn holds d2, which is a critical escape square for the king in this position, so capturing the knight on d6 is absolutely out of the question for white. So what now? They must defend against mate in 1. They're forced to capture the pawn on e3. But then follows another incredibly strong move, knight e4, taking away 2 escape squares from the white king, f2 and d2. Mate in 1 is once again threatened. Yes, white can interpose a piece, but after a series of exchanges, black will fork the king and bishop. Black is willing to go for that, even though it costs them the f7 pawn, because the knight from d6 is now gone. And here's the twist. Magnus didn't calculate this correctly. Now, if he captures the pawn on f7 with the rook, black simply steps the king to g6. He keeps the rook under control, and if the bishop leaves the diagonal, mate on c1 becomes a threat again. White is then forced to run with the king to f1. Rook c1, check. The king retreats to g2, and rook c2, attacking absolutely everything. In this position, white has the e2 pawn hanging, the bishop on a2 is hanging, and even the rook on f7 could be vulnerable. This position is just pure suffering for white, and as you can see, their pawn structure is totally broken. Even escaping alive from this is not guaranteed for Magnus. So instead of capturing on f7 with the rook, Magnus retreats the king to f1. Rook c1 check comes anyway, and after king to g2, the rook enters c2. Now e2 and a2 are both under threat, so Magnus captures f7 with the bishop instead. This gives him access to potential discovered checks. For example, if the bishop moves and checks the king, it might also take the knight. Black grabs the pawn on e2 with check. The king is forced back to g1, and after another couple of checks, Magnus is basically okay with a draw at this point. He just wants to get out of this alive. Black king goes to f6, escaping from the threat of discovered checks. After the bishop retreats with the rook, Magnus centralizes his bishop again to d5, attacking the knight. And here comes another brilliant move. Rook to d2, pitting the bishop on d5 to the white rook on d7. Now, retreating or capturing becomes disadvantageous, since white would lose the rook on d7. Magnus checks the black king. The king retreats to g6, still keeping an eye on the rook. Capturing the knight now is also bad. After trades, white is left without material. So Magnus retreats again to d7, but now that the black king has moved to the light square g6, he's preparing to take on e4 with check, and then capture the rook on d2. But Hans Niemann, of course, has something up his sleeve. An absolute brilliancy, almost the move of the entire game. Knight to g5. It looks like white simply wins the rook on d2 after the discovered check with the bishop. And Magnus does just that. To be fair, he didn't really have many other moves here. If he had moved the king instead, then knight to f3 would follow, and the white king gets absolutely harassed. The black king would join on the king side, eat everything, and possibly deliver mate with the rook. So, bishop to f7, check to the king. Capturing the rook follows next. The black king goes to f5 since the bishop is protected by the rook. And after the capture on d2, here's the whole point of this position. Hans had calculated far in advance the knight fork with knight to f3, forking the king and rook. The white king retreats, and black captures the rook on d2. Let's take a look at what we have here. White has 3 pawns. Black has 4. But more importantly, black has 2 connected pawn islands on the queen side and the king side, while white's pawns are isolated, spread out in 3 separate islands. And the worst part? The white king is too far from the queen side to stop the 2 connected black pawns. After a trade of 1 pair, black will easily create a passed pawn. So Magnus tries to prevent that with a5, clamping down on black's structure. Now, if black tries to push, white will capture and maybe push his own pawn to queen. But by placing his pawn on a dark square, Magnus dooms it. His light-squared bishop will never be able to defend it. Black will simply gobble it up. And here comes yet another brilliant move. In fact, the only move that allows black to continue playing for a win. King to e5, seizing the critical square and blocking the white bishop from occupying e5 or d5. White wanted to place the bishop on d5 to munch on black's pawns placed on light squares, but this king move shuts down all of Magnus's hopes. Magnus plays king to g3, aiming to take the pawn on g4. But Hans responds with knight to f1, a triple fork. It turns out that taking the pawn on g4 is simply not an option anymore. Magnus doesn't go for it, but let's see what would have happened. If white had captured the pawn on g4, then black takes on h2, and the king rushes to h5. White tries to chase the pawn on h6, black gives it up, but then circles back to take the e3 pawn. And we return to that nightmare position. Black's king walks across the dark squares toward the white pawn stuck on a dark square. He eats it, while the bishop just stands there helpless, like a fool. After knight to f1 check, the white king returns to f2, defending the e3 pawn. But now Magnus gives up the pawn on h2. At this point, Magnus still has a small trick left up his sleeve. He throws down a weak trump card, e4, opening the path to bring his bishop back to the long-awaited d5 square. This might have given white a chance to eat up all the queenside pawns and push his own passer, but that little six of spades gets countered by Hans's ace. Black takes on e4, and Magnus keeps hunting for those queenside pawns. But Hans has calculated everything. King to f4. He doesn't care about his queenside pawns. The kingside ones are much more important. Knight to f3 follows. And after bishop takes on b7, Magnus gobbles up every queenside pawn. But now black's knight jumps to c6, and Magnus simply won't have time to push his pawn. His bishop is absolutely useless after moving to b7. Hans captures the a5 pawn with the knight. Then Magnus pulls off one last trick. He places his bishop on d5, seemingly cutting off black's knight entirely from the game. But black has way too many pawns. They just keep marching forward. Bishop to f7, attacking the h5 pawn, but h4 follows. And after the bishop returns to d5, Magnus, without even waiting for Hans Niemann's move, simply resigns. There's no way to stop those pawns with a single bishop. Let's take a look at what Magnus saw that made him give up immediately. Black goes king to e5, forcing the bishop off d5, and finally freeing up the knight. Now the knight can safely return to the game. In theory, white might try h3, aiming to trade his bishop for the two black pawns and salvage a draw, but of course, black won't allow that. King to f4 would follow, and as white just shuffles back and forth in confusion, unsure of what to do, h3 gets played, and after the bishop drops back to d5, g3, and the pawns inevitably queen. If white tries bringing the king back, now g2 is not possible for black, since white would simply take and secure a draw after the exchanges. But black calmly brings the knight in to support the pawns. After king to e2, knight to f2, and now nothing can stop the pawns from queening. Say white's king returns, h2, bishop to g2. You can try, but it's hopeless. h1 equals queen. Game over. Captured. Captured. The pawn becomes a queen. Unstoppable. And that's how this incredible game shook the chess world. Hans Niemann played with phenomenal precision, and Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, was left shocked and defeated. Whatever your opinion may be about the controversy, this game speaks for itself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more high-level chess breakdowns.